I am going to show you how a single, unbearable smell in the summer of 1858 managed to achieve what decades of political debate and thousands of deaths couldn't, forcing the most powerful empire on earth to finally rebuild the very foundation of its capital. The heat in London during the early days of June 1858 wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a catalyst for a sensory catastrophe that had been decades in the making. You have to imagine a city that had grown far too large for its own skin, a metropolitan monster of nearly 3 million people all living on top of an infrastructure that was essentially unchanged since the Middle Ages. For centuries, Londoners had relied on a haphazard system of cesspools buried beneath their floorboards, essentially giant pits of human waste that were supposed to be emptied by nightmen, but often just overflowed into the soil and the foundations of the houses themselves. But as the population exploded, the city tried to solve the problem by connecting these overflowing pits to the existing surface water drains, which were never designed for sewage. These drains emptied directly into the River Thames, turning the primary artery of the British Empire into nothing more than an open, pulsing sewer that rose and fell with the tides. By the time the record-breaking heatwave of 1858 hit, the river had reached a literal breaking point where the water was no longer liquid, but a thick, black, fermented soup of industrial chemicals, animal carcasses, and the waste of millions. When the sun began to bake this mixture at temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, the resulting stench became so physical and so aggressive that it could be felt as much as it could be smelled. It wasn't just a bad odor, it was a biological weapon that brought the functioning of the world's most powerful city to a total, grinding halt. This wasn't just a matter of discomfort because at the time, everyone believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases like cholera and typhoid were actually carried through the air by foul smells. So when the great stink rose from the river, people weren't just plugging their noses, they were genuinely terrified that the air itself was turning into a cloud of death. They watched the riverbanks get coated in a foot-deep crust of what they called sewage mud that would bubble and hiss in the sun, releasing gases that were strong enough to turn the white lead paint on riverboats black within hours. The fear was so intense that the law courts near the river had to be abandoned, and the Queen herself, attempting a short pleasure cruise on the Thames, had to retreat back to land within 5 minutes because she was on the verge of fainting. But the real drama was happening inside the Houses of Parliament, which sat right on the edge of the river. The very men who had spent years arguing against the cost of a new sewage system were now trapped in their own chambers, gagging on the consequences of their inaction. They tried to soak the heavy curtains of Parliament in chloride of lime to neutralize the scent, but it did nothing to stop the overwhelming wall of rot that forced members to flee the library with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. It is a perfect example of how humans often ignore a slow-creeping crisis until it literally hits them in the face, because suddenly, the cost of the project didn't matter as much as the ability to breathe. Therefore, the political gridlock that had lasted for 20 years evaporated in a matter of 18 days as the government realized that if they didn't act, they would have to relocate the entire seat of power away from London. They turned to Joseph Bazalgette, a man who had been shouting into the wind for years about a solution that everyone said was too expensive and too ambitious. Bazalgette's plan was a marvel of Victorian hubris and engineering, involving the construction of over 80 miles of massive main intercepting sewers and more than 1,000 miles of street sewers. But the scale of the task was almost unimaginable because he had to dig up the entire city while it was still functioning. He wasn't just laying pipes, he was creating an artificial underground river system that would use gravity to pull the waste away from the city center and toward the lower reaches of the Thames where it could be swept out to sea. This required the construction of the massive Thames embankment, which actually reclaimed land from the river and changed the map of London forever. He used 318 million bricks and moved enough earth to fill a mountain, but his true genius lay in his foresight regarding the city's growth. When his colleagues asked him what size the pipes should be, he calculated the maximum possible population density, and then, in a moment of sheer brilliance, he decided to double the diameter of the pipes. He said that since they were only going to do this once, they should make it so that the system would still work 100 years later. Because he made that decision, the sewers he built in the 1860s are still the backbone of London's waste management today, handling a population that he could never have fully envisioned. However, the struggle wasn't just against the earth and the river, it was against a deep-seated misunderstanding of science. Even as Bazalgette was building this masterpiece, the medical establishment was still arguing about how people were actually getting sick. A doctor named John Snow had already proved during a previous cholera outbreak that the disease was waterborne, not airborne, but the government ignored him because his findings would have required an even more expensive overhaul of the water supply. It's a tragic irony that the Great Stink actually accelerated the right solution for the wrong reasons. The politicians built the sewers because they were afraid of the smell, thinking the smell was the killer, when in reality, the sewers saved London because they finally separated the drinking water from the waste. If the smell hadn't been so offensive, they might have continued to drink the contaminated water for another 20 years, and the death toll from cholera would have reached hundreds of thousands more. So the stench was essentially a massive, disgusting alarm clock that woke the city up just before it was too late. But then, as the project progressed, the sheer physical reality of the construction began to weigh on the city. Entire neighborhoods were demolished, the underground railway had to be rerouted, and the Thames itself was narrowed and constrained by the new granite walls. It was a total transformation of the urban landscape that demonstrated just how much a society is willing to sacrifice when its immediate survival is threatened by its own waste. As the system finally began to come online in the mid-1860s, the results were instantaneous and dramatic. The recurring cholera epidemics that had haunted London for generations simply stopped. The river, while still not clean by modern standards, ceased to be a fermented bog and became a moving body of water again. But there was a darker side to the victory that people often overlook, which was the fact that Bazalgette's system didn't actually treat the sewage, it just moved it. By pushing the waste further down the river to places like Crossness and Abbey Mills, the city was essentially just making the problem someone else's concern. This led to a horrific disaster years later, when a passenger steamship called the Princess Alice sank right at the point where the main sewer was discharging into the river. Over 600 people died, many of them not from drowning, but from the toxic shock of being plunged into the concentrated sewage that was still being dumped into the Thames at the time. This forced yet another evolution in how we think about urban life, leading to the first primitive sewage treatment works. It shows that even the most brilliant engineering solutions often just move the goalposts of the problem until the next crisis arrives. So when you look at the beautiful Victorian architecture of the London Embankment today, you're not just looking at a pretty walkway, you're looking at the lid of a massive, subterranean machine that was born out of a summer of absolute filth. The Great Stink taught the world that the health of the poorest citizen is directly linked to the health of the richest, because a virus doesn't care if you live in a slum or a palace if you're both breathing the same air or drinking the same water. It was the moment that the concept of public health changed from a charitable suggestion into a mandatory function of the state. It makes you wonder what invisible crises we are ignoring today simply because they don't smell bad enough to force us to change our lives. We often wait for the stink to become unbearable before we fund the solution, but the lesson of 1858 is that by the time you can't breathe, you've already waited far too long. The scale of the London sewers is a testament to what we can achieve when our backs are against the wall, but it's also a reminder of the massive cost of reactive thinking. Bazalgette is a hero today, but in his time, he was a man struggling against a wall of apathy that only cracked when the politicians themselves started to gag. It's a recurring theme in human history where progress is paid for in the currency of a near catastrophe. Consequently, the legacy of that summer isn't just in the bricks and mortar under the streets, but in the very way our modern cities are organized. Every time you turn on a tap and expect clean water, or flush a toilet and expect the waste to vanish, you are living in the world that was forged in the heat of 1858. We take for granted the invisible systems that keep us alive, forgetting that they were built by men who had to fight through a thicket of scientific ignorance and political cowardice. The Great Stink was a moment of profound humiliation for the British Empire, a realization that they could conquer half the world but couldn't manage their own bathrooms. But out of that humiliation came a feat of engineering that arguably did more to save lives than any medical discovery of the 19th century. It transformed London from a giant, lethal trap into a sustainable modern metropolis, proving that the foundation of civilization isn't just our ideas or our art, but the way we handle the most basic, visceral realities of our physical existence. But even as the project was hailed as a total success, there were those who whispered that the next great crisis wouldn't be as obvious as a smell, and that the next time the city broke, we might not have a Bazalgette ready with a plan to double the diameter of the solution before it's even been built. The sheer volume of the work Bazalgette undertook is hard to wrap your head around even now. He had to account for the rise and fall of the tide twice a day, which meant his entire system of pipes had to be perfectly graded to ensure the waste kept moving even when the river was pushing back. He designed massive pumping stations that were essentially cathedrals of steam and iron, like Abbey Mills, which featured ornate Gothic architecture for a building that was essentially just a giant heart for the city's bowels. He understood that to make people support such a disgusting project, he had to give it a sense of majesty and permanence. He used Portland cement, which was a relatively new and unproven material at the time, because he insisted on the highest possible quality to prevent the pipes from corroding under the chemical assault of the sewage. This obsession with quality is the only reason the system didn't collapse under the weight of the 20th century's growth. But as we move further into the 21st century, Even Bazalgette's doubled capacity is finally being reached, and London is once again facing the reality of sewage overflowing into the Thames during heavy rains. We are currently building a new super sewer, the Tideway Tunnel, which is essentially just a massive expansion of the original Victorian vision. It's a direct continuation of the work started in 1858, a reminder that the battle against our own environment is never truly won, only managed. If you think about the sheer amount of waste produced by a city of 9 million people today, you realize that we are still standing on the shoulders of those Victorian engineers who decided that the smell was finally too much to bear. They didn't just build a sewer, they built a template for the modern world. They showed that the government has a fundamental responsibility to the physical well-being of its people, a concept that was revolutionary at the time. The Great Stink was a crisis of infrastructure, but it was also a crisis of identity for a nation that thought it was the most advanced on Earth. It forced a moment of brutal honesty that changed the trajectory of urban development forever. But then again, it's worth asking if we have really learned the lesson, or if we are just waiting for the next modern version of that 1858 heatwave to force our hands on the crises of our own time. The smell might be gone, but the cycle of neglect followed by desperate, massive intervention seems to be a permanent feature of how we build our world. The story of the Great Stink is a story of how we fail to see what's right in front of us until it becomes impossible to ignore, and how, when we finally do act, we are capable of moving the earth itself to fix it. The complexity of the London Underground today is a direct result of that one summer. When you think about the layers of history beneath your feet, the oldest and most vital layer is that network of brick tunnels. Bazalgette had to fight with the builders of the first underground railway, the Metropolitan Line, because they were both trying to occupy the same space beneath the streets. There were points where the sewer had to go over the railway, and points where it had to go under, requiring a level of three-dimensional planning that was entirely new. This paved the way for the utility corridor concept where water, gas, and eventually electricity and fiber optics would all follow the paths carved out by the search for a way to escape the smell. It's fascinating how a desire for fresh air led to the literal blueprint for how every modern city on the planet is wired and piped. Yet, for all the engineering brilliance, the memory of the Great Stink faded remarkably quickly once the water cleared. People returned to their lives, the politicians took credit for the foresight they originally lacked, and the Thames became a place of recreation once more. But the silence of the sewers is where the real story lives, a silent, dark, and massive testament to a time when London almost choked on its own success. As we look at the rising temperatures of our current era, the echoes of 1858 are starting to sound louder and louder. We are seeing more once-in-a-century events that are straining the systems we inherited. The Thames Tideway Tunnel is our generation's answer to the same problem Bazalgette faced, but we are doing it with the knowledge that he was right all along. We aren't just building for today. We are building for a future we can't fully predict. It makes you appreciate the audacity of a man who looked at a fermented river and saw a way to clean it using nothing but bricks and the pull of the moon's gravity on the tides. The Great Stink wasn't just a disaster. It was the birth of the idea that a city is a living organism that needs to breathe and circulate just like a human body. When that circulation stops, the results are catastrophic, but when it's fixed, the possibilities for growth are limitless. So next time you walk along the river in London, think about the black, bubbling crust that once covered the shore and the men who had to flee the most expensive building in the world because they couldn't handle the smell of their own neglect. It is a powerful reminder that while we can ignore reality for a long time, reality eventually has a way of making itself heard, or in this case, smelled, in a way that no one can ignore. The final connection in this story is perhaps the most important one, which is the link between the smell and the science of the future. The transition from the miasma theory to the germ theory was one of the most significant shifts in human history, and the Great Stink was the turning point. It provided the data that eventually proved Jon Snow right. When the sewers were built and the smell went away, the diseases went away too. Scientists began to realize that it wasn't the air, but what the sewers were carrying away from the water supply. This led to the birth of modern microbiology and the understanding of how to prevent pandemics before they start. So, the Great Stink didn't just give us sewers, it gave us the foundation of modern medicine. It's a strange thought that the most disgusting event in the history of London was also its most productive, leading to a world where we can live in close proximity to millions of other people without the constant threat of a cholera outbreak. It was a brutal, stinking lesson in humility, but it was a lesson that the world desperately needed to learn, and one that we would do well to remember as we face the environmental challenges of our own century. The question remains whether we will wait for our own version of the Great Stink to settle over us, or if we will have the foresight to build the next great system before the heat starts to rise again, though history suggests that humans rarely move until the air becomes too thick to breathe.